Hi everyone, this is BritSimon. I just wanted to create a quick video for you. I hope this will be quick. Looking at the CEAC data that's been published today on Zarthisis's site. Um, Hopefully by now you'll know what this data is about, and so I don't need to explain that. But I'll put the link for this data below in the description below. And I want to talk to you about the progress that's being made. And I think given the relative surprise there was by many people on the last visa bulletin for Europe numbers, that's where I want to spend most of my focus at the moment in terms of explaining what happened, updating a little bit more about what happened there. Because now we can see the explanation that I was trying to give before. So let's go through that. So firstly, you should be able to come into this page and you can see how many visas have been issued to date in each of the regions. We're still massively behind where we should be. I've talked about that before. Basically, that's because we haven't done as many interviews as we need, and they KCC really need to put the pedal down to get this to get the number of visa interviews we need to see in order to get the rest of the visas issued. Now, having said that, it's not really their main importance to issue all the visas. That's not really their job. They respond to the activities of the people that are the selectees. If the selectees don't follow the instructions, don't send in the documents, KCC can't be blamed for that, right? So they will schedule people that have taken the actions necessary to be scheduled, but they're not going to lose sleep if they only issue 40,000 visas out of the possible 55,000 visas. They won't lose any sleep. They won't get fired. It's not their problem. They're all American citizens living in the USA. They're fine. So, this really is down to the selectees to get the documents in, to put in the DS260 to figure out whether KCC have the correct documents or not, and therefore get scheduled as quickly as possible. Okay, so we can see the regions here by changing region from one region to another. We can see how the chart looks in each region, and for EU it is particularly interesting. You can use this slider bar. There are 3 files we've had now, so you can use this slider bar to go back to the February the 1st and January the 1st or the 2nd. To see the relative progress there has been month to month in terms of the number of cases scheduled, etc. You can come in and do this yourself, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining that, but you can see that whereas last month there were almost no cases, there were a few cases, but almost no cases scheduled between 14,000 and 21,000, which was already current in that month. You can see that block of cases is now scheduled, either with the green color there, which means ready meaning the case was submitted to the embassy and accepted by the embassy and marked on CEAC as ready for interview, or in that blue color, meaning the case is in transit. That simply means KCC has sent it to the embassy, but the embassy haven't yet marked the case in CEAC as having been received. Now we know there are 2 batches of 2NLs sent out each month. One is sent almost immediately after over the next few days after the visa bulletin is released, and the other is sent out just before the end of the month. So that happened on Thursday of last week, and so all the cases now have been scheduled for that were going to be scheduled in the month of February for the month of April interviews. right? The next interviews will be scheduled in March, in late March for the month of May. So we now have 5 months remaining: May, June, July, August, and September. 5 months remaining for the rest of the interviews. Now I have calculated for people, there are around about 8,800 cases between 21,000 and the highest number in Europe. Okay, so I mentioned in a previous video a couple of weeks ago that we needed to see a fairly dramatic improvement in the number of cases scheduled month to month. And the most scheduled interviews I've seen in EU in previous years is around about 1,200 interviews per month maximum. So typically a good month would be 1,000 or 1,100, and on rare occasion we would see something like 1,200 interviews for EU. Africa can see 2,000 interviews quite happily because it's a bigger region, and also because there are more embassies, but also there are more people scheduled for interview and less people show up for their interviews. That tends to be the way that works. But for EU, back to EU, 8,800 cases then need to be scheduled, or some percentage of them, probably around about 60% will respond. We can see that from previous number ranges, it looks like around about 60% of cases, 60 to 65% at most, of those cases will want interviews. So we have something like, out of 8,800, probably something like 5,000 to 6,000 cases remaining that will want interviews. And that means in the lower number ranges and also in the ranges above 21,000 as well, right? So let's say 5 to 6,000. So clearly we're at the point where we need to see KCC scheduling the maximum number of cases for EU every single month from now on. Okay, so I took a look at the file. There are a couple of files that are produced. One is the raw data for each given month, and then if you look down the bottom of the page each month, Zarthisius calculates how many 2NLs are handed out each month, and that's a really important piece of data that we need to know. You can see, for example, in March, looking at that data, if I filter for EU, there are, let's see, used to seeing the number showing up at the bottom there, but I'll just drag down. Let's see how many cases there are. Okay, there are 601 cases were scheduled for March interviews in EU. That's nowhere near enough. That represented a problem, obviously, and I believe now that problem has been addressed, because in April, if we look at the number of cases scheduled for interview in April, I'll just turn this on and see if we can get back to my numbers here. Turn this off again. Okay. Well, yeah, here we go. It's now showing me that out of 3,652 2NLs sent this month amongst all the regions, 1,357 of them were in EU, which is a spectacular amount of interviews. Extremely strong effort there from KCC. They must have done a lot of work to schedule these interviews, and it really shows that they are trying to schedule as many interviews as possible for each of the remaining months, I would hope. Now let me just show you another aspect that's interesting from this 2NL file. If you look down the numbers, these are the case numbers. Here are the case numbers here, but if you look down these numbers, you can see the numbers are all of them, almost all of them, are for cases that were current under 21,000, right, that were already current in the previous month. They were current for March. They could have been interviewed in March, but they weren't, and so they're scheduled instead for April. And this is exactly why KCC didn't need to increase the EU number, because if we look at, let's go right up to 21,000 here. If we just scroll down, right, so 21,000. So the cutoff for March had been 21,000, and they increased by 200 to 21,200 for the month of April, which was almost no cases at all. And then you can see that they've scheduled 25 cases above case number 21,000. So in other words, out of the 1,357 cases that they've scheduled, 1,330 of them were from backlog, from cases already current previously. Okay, huge number of cases that had not been scheduled previously. And you just have to look through these numbers to figure out what's going on. So this is people who had their documents either submitted late or took a long time to process, or there was some sort of backlog caused by the mass interview email that was sent out in October asking for documents, which then would have come in November and December, leading to the backlog that we saw affecting us in January and on into February here. So, excuse me. So it's clear that KCC are doing what they can, but they also, and I have spoken to the manager at KCC, and he did tell me that they had addressed the backlog, and quite clearly they have. You can see that the numbers of the number of cases scheduled is tremendous. So they have addressed the backlog. They're working as hard as they can, but they still feel that people aren't sending in their documents as fast as they should be, and that is ultimately going to affect other cases. So, so what do we expect from here on out? Well, we can do a little bit of prediction. I don't like predicting because people hang on my words with too much strength. They tend to think this is a precise science. It isn't. Predictions, I've seen many people who feel they've nailed the prediction process. It's not possible really to understand exactly what's going to happen at any given time. We just don't have all the data. But I can tell you a little bit about what's going to go on, I think, over the next month at least, and couple of months. So if we look at the full file now, and and we count the number of cases that we think would be needed to fill up, let's say 1,300 cases, right? Some of the 1,300 interview slots for next month, let's say there are 1,300, that would be in another enormous month. I'm not sure they can do 1,300. But let's say some of those, let's say they do 1,300 in the EU, and let's say some of those come from earlier cases that are late document submissions or just took a long time to process. Let's say 300 of those cases go to the earlier cases. Remember, almost all of the interview slots went to backlog cases last month. But I think that's generally got us more up to date. So I'm saying that maybe only 300 cases would go to backlog, right? That's the first assumption, and it's just a guess, right? This is part of what I'm saying. We can't really predict very well. Then the next thing you'd have to sort of know or guess is to do with let's just get my calculator up here. Is to do with the number of cases that will respond or will have responded and had their DS-260 processed and their documents processed, right? So let's take a number and say 65% of the cases will need interviews. So if 1,000 interviews will go to new case numbers, and that 1,000 interviews is it represents 65% of cases, which is the response rate that I'm going to assume. which is fairly high, fairly pessimistic, right? So we say 1,000 divided by 65 times 100 to get us back to a whole number, right? So that would be 1,500 real cases that we would need to see, right? That we would chew through in terms of a number release, right? So I've gone fairly pessimistic on the response rate, and hopefully you understand what I'm doing here. But I'm then going to add 1,500 cases, actual real cases, on top of the 21,200. So we'll get to that 21,200 there. We're going to count down 1,500 cases, and you can see somewhere around about there, right? You can see I've gone down 1,529 cases, and that would get us to 26,455. Let's say 26. Let's call it 26,500. Right. So if there are 1,000 interviews that went to new cases, and if 65% was the correct response rate, then they would need to move the next visa bulletin to 26,500 to yield enough cases at that response rate in order to fill the number of cases. Again, assume lots of assumptions going on here. I'm assuming they're going to do 1,300 interviews again. I'm assuming only 300 will go to previously backlogged cases. I'm assuming that the response rate would be 65%, which is fairly high, actually. And so lots of big assumptions going on here. And if all those assumptions were true, and there were 1,000 cases that were to be interviewed, then we could get to about 26,500. Right? If I change that a little bit and do a similar sort of computation for a slightly different set of assumptions, let's go a bit more optimistic. Let's say that only 60% of cases will want an interview, and let's say there will be 1,100 cases to be interviewed, right? So we'll do a same sort of thing again, divide by 60, multiply by 100. There's a simpler way of doing that, of course. Whoops, oh dear. Well, I'll just work it out. So it's 1,800 cases. 1,800 cases. So we could add another 300 cases to this. Let's go up there. We'll add another 300. Okay, and that would take us to 27,500. Right. So if we take my first number as a sort of a pessimistic range, based on a number of big assumptions, and we take the second number as a slightly more optimistic range, we could see our range, our predictability, or our range of likely number to be something between 26,500 and 27,500. Let's give ourselves a buffer and let's say 26 to 28,000, right? So, my expectation would be that we would get to a VB number of around about 26 to 28,000 on the next VB, which will be released in about 14 or 15 days from now. And then we can continue that process, right? Let's say that was correct. Let's say we get to 27,500. And let's say in the following month they do the same sort of thing again, and we can increase by another 1,800 cases. Let's see where that would be. We'll look forward a couple of months. This is getting more and more outrageous in terms of prediction. There's no real science to this. I've made some wacky guesses based on absolutely nothing, really. So don't read too much into this. But then that would take us to nearly 34,000 the month after that, which would be for June interviews. We'd go ahead and do July interviews. We'd do another 1,800 cases. Same sort of optimistic numbers here. I'm going on the optimistic side. Oops, I've gone a little bit too far. So somewhere around here, let's say, let's call it around about 41,000, right? About something around about there. 41,000 about there. Okay, so we'd say that would be for June. Hang on, went on 3. That would be July rather. And then we'd have August and September. Let's do another 1,800 cases for August. Okay, another 1,800 cases, and again, we'd be at about 48,000, 48,500, something like that, about there, let's say. And then finally for September, that would leave around about, let's see what would be left, 1,500, 1,600 cases left. So in that model, bearing in mind that there are adequate visas, the visa allocation is not a problem. In that model, there would be enough time to interview all the cases, but understand what I'm doing here is a very glib, very simplistic way to estimate. I'm estimating that they're going to keep up the pace of 1,300 interviews per month for all 5 months. That's a big assumption. Bear in mind last month was 600 cases, so can they keep up that pace without the embassies pushing back and saying, hey, you're sending us too many cases? I'm not entirely sure they're going to keep up that pace. Are we only going to see 60% as a response rate? It could be nearer 65. If it's 65%, then these numbers don't hold. Then we would see a cutoff lower, lower than our 55,000 highest case number. Let's say more than 300 cases per month go to the backlog cases. Again, it wouldn't be a total shock, that's happened before, that backlog cases take more of the case numbers, of the interview numbers each month. And bearing in mind last month, almost all of the cases went to that big gap of unsatisfied case numbers that were current but not scheduled for interview because of documentation. So, I'm making some pretty big, bold assumptions there and drawing a very optimistic picture. So I'm not by any means saying we're out of the woods, but is it technically possible to get to the end of the numbers? Yes, it is. Is it likely that we'll have a cutoff? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think I'm probably being over optimistic in saying that we're going to get to the right to the end. I think there's more probability there'll be a cutoff because they'll have too much work to do in this remaining 5 months than not. But where it'll be cut off, I don't know. I'm not going to get into those sort of predictions. I'm showing you how to use the data. If you want to do your own predictions, you're welcome to do so. You can look at it how you want, but I can tell you in the next month, I'm looking for them to do a similar number of interviews that they did this month, but this time that would be new case numbers. And if they do that and they continue to do that for 5 months, then we'll be in pretty good shape. But if they're not able to keep up that pace of 1,300 interviews per month, and if the response rate is higher than I'm talking about, or the backlog cases take too many of those interviews, then there will be a cutoff before the final number in EU is reached, and some people will miss out. So that's an explanation of what's going on. It's now not so much about the mathematical calculation about how many visas there are. It's about how many interviews there are. That's what we should be considering now as being the sort of the most important point. I did a similar exercise for the other regions. The other regions are in pretty good shape. I've been saying for some time. Asia is obviously going to go current. There's so many selectees are affected by the travel ban within Asia that there's just no way in the world it's not going to go current. Africa is looking pretty good, but Africa is having a little bit of a backlog problem, I think. Not so much at KCC, simply in Africa itself, people not sending their documents, or they've sent their documents and they don't realize that really they didn't do a proper job of sending their documents, and so they're going to miss out unless they realize what's going on. Africa is affected that way. Oceania is about to go current. I would expect it to go current next month or the month after. Oceania is moving very fast. South America is probably going to be our biggest miss. I'll show you why. So basically, there are still a lot of cases at, let's say, something like a 50% response rate that will want interviews, but there simply isn't enough time. They're scheduling around about 100 interviews per month. That means there's 500 interview slots left, let's say, after this month, and that's just no way enough slots to meet all this demand for cases, for interviews, I should say. So I think there is going to be a cutoff. I think we're going to get somewhere around about the 3,000 mark, possibly a little bit above that. But I expect people in this number range to be greatly at risk and possibly miss out, between 3,000 and 4,000. So that's how things are going in other regions. We're not going to see all of the visas issued this year, 55,000 visas. We won't see it issued. I can pretty much guarantee that at this point, because there just isn't enough time to fill now 40,000, 45,000 visas in the remaining time. Obviously, the scheduling is a 2 months ahead of the actual processing. So this number is only after the end of February. That means there are 7 full months left of processing, but 7 months to produce 45,000 visas, it's not going to happen. There's no way that's going to happen. And EU fit within its quota? Absolutely. If we take 7 months left and there's only less than 4,000 issued at this point, and there are 7 months of interviews left, and March was only 600, even if they do 1,300 interviews in the remaining months each month, that would be a total of around about 6,000 interviews. If everybody was approved, which is not going to happen, that would be something like, let's say, 12,000 people being approved. So, there easily is space within EU's quota for everybody remaining to get visas. As I say, for EU in particular, it's not a question of whether there's enough visas, it's a question of whether there is enough time to schedule the interviews. Okay, so I've gone on a little bit longer than I thought I would, as usual, so it's a longer video than it should have been, but hopefully this has given you an idea of how you can use the data to do your own analysis, and I've given you some ideas about EU in particular. If you're interested in other regions, you can follow a similar sort of principle and have a look at the data for that, for those regions. But do have a look at the raw data, both for number of issued here and also for the 2NLs, which is important data for us to have a look at each month as well. All right. Okay, well, I hope that's covered everything for you. Let me know what you think of this video, and give me a thumbs up if you like it. And please make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you get plenty of information from me as it comes out. Okay? All right, have a good night now. Bye-bye.